All right, guys, for this recording, since it's not really a lecture, I'm going to go over the primary sources. I was just going to do Mesopotamian outlook on the gods, life and death, the primary source packet, but I decided to do a little bit on Hammurabi's Law Code. I'm also going to do Hammurabi's Law Code a little bit in the lecture, so kind of just split it up, but then this way you have this component as well. So let's just start from the first one here. We have women and family, and looking at what were the questions, right? What were women's roles and place in society, and how did the law codes protect women? We're going to look at how did the law codes protect women first, and then as we're doing that, that kind of answers number one as well. So the very first one, and I pointed this one out in the Zoom meeting, for one of the classes and will for the other ones as we get to it, has to do with the very first one on the list here, with if anyone point the finger, which it tells you right here, that means slander. So it's false accusations, right? At a sister of God is a priestess, okay? So anytime you see a sister of God, that means a priestess or the wife of anyone, and cannot prove it, this man shall be taken before the judges, and his brow shall be marked by cutting the skin or perhaps the hair. So what they would do is they'd literally like cut a line separating your eyebrow between, like, so you'd have a line in between just the middle of your eyebrow. And why they would do this, and this becomes important for a couple of the law codes later, is that the idea is that anyone who looked at you would then know that you couldn't be trusted. And this was a serious thing. It may sound like oh, big deal. They're cutting a line in the eyebrow. No, if people saw you with this, then you were not to be trusted. Your word in court would no longer matter, and it really did hurt your business and kind of social standing. So it was a big deal. It was significant if this happened to you, and it was meant to prevent false accusations that then could, take up court time, but also potentially hurt other people. So where this gets important, where you see it specifically mentioned, has to do with 131 and 132, where it's mentioned. Now, these two are very tricky because they sound like the same thing, and yet the consequences are different. So if a man bring a charge against one's wife, but she is not surprised with another man, this means caught in the act. Okay, so if she isn't caught in the act of cheating, she must take an oath and then may be returned to her house. So if a man bring a charge against one's wife, this is the key line that's going to be different. Because in the next one, if the finger is pointed at a man's wife, there's the difference. But with another man, but she is not caught in the act, so same thing. And that one they say not caught sleeping with the other man, she shall jump into the river for her husband. Okay, so think about that. Why are these two different? What's going on that makes that different? Well, the first one would be the husband. The second one is someone else. And so why does that matter? Well, the first one is a lesser consequence. If your husband accused you of cheating and yet didn't catch you in the act, all you have to do is swear an oath and then you go home. Why do that? Well, because there obviously had been problems with, if we're going to look at the divorce laws in a minute, if there was cause for divorce, specifically with ruining the house, which cheating would fall under that, the husband does not have to provide the dowry back. And that word dowry, we're going to see several times. Dowry was something that was given by the woman's family when she got married, and it went with her to her marriage. And it could be any kind of movable property. So furniture, clothing, slaves, actual like valuables that would be considered money, things like that. And it had a value. And she went into the marriage. The dowry by Mesopotamian law could not be diminished you would use this stuff usually, but you couldn't diminish it, and it was protected by law. So if you had a deadbeat husband who spent all your money, the court system and the society essentially provided that dowry to you. So you kind of had this. And then women also could control that, where they could give their dowry and their will to whichever child they wanted, or children if they wanted to split it up. Usually women in Mesopotamian society didn't have the ability to do anything else with a will. That was all their husbands, because the men tended to own most of the property, which actually answer this question: what were women's roles and place in society? Well, if the men are able to control the entire will because they own all the property, it's a patriarchal society. So we'll mention when we see laws that clearly show how it's a patriarchal society. This is one of them, actually, in itself, because it's not talking about if men get caught in the act of cheating. It's only if women get caught. This goes to that reading I had you look at before with the idea of women and virginity, and that emphasis only on women with that because of the patriarchal society. So the dowry, right? There obviously was, because these are reactive law codes. So they're only making these law codes when it becomes a problem. So there must have been a problem with husbands falsely accusing their wives of cheating, but they weren't catching them in the act, in order to not have to pay a dowry when they divorced them. So for 131, you just basically, your husband can't accuse you if he hasn't caught you in the act, because of that problem. But 132, if the finger is pointed at a man's wife, that's someone else. So if someone else accuses a woman of cheating, even if they didn't catch her in the act of it, she shall jump into the river for her husband. This was a trial, and you see these in older societies. It's kind of like the trial by fire, essentially, and the belief is that the gods would prove your guilt or innocence, and this did happen. As we're going to look at, a lot of the punishments in Hammurabi's Law Codes don't actually happen. They preferred monetary compensation over chopping someone's hands off. It was more like, this is the guideline of it, and but that's not what they tended to do. So it looks brutal. I know if you're reading through these, you're like, oh my gosh, they're cutting off limbs, they're crushing bones, they're killing children. No, they didn't. We have a ton of court cases where we see that they did not do that. People wanted monetary compensation, and you might get sold into debt slavery. That did happen. Or you pay stuff. It was rare that, a physical thing happened. It did occasionally, but it was rare. So when you're looking at these, think of this more as just trying to show the level of consequence. But the reality is that that's not the punishment that they actually doled out. Instead, it tended to be like monetary compensation for things. But jumping in the river did sometimes happen. More often than not, what did happen is, instead of, if the woman, basically it was in a way to potentially have a divorce. So if you refuse to jump in the river for your husband to prove it, then he could potentially initiate a divorce. Now, he still may have to pay a dowry, but he would have some excuse to do so. If you jumped in the river and swam across the river and lived, then he had no cause whatsoever, because the gods deemed you innocent. If you tried to swim across the river and drowned, then you were guilty, and that was the god's punishment. So we have cases of women doing that. One was a royal woman who sent her servant in her place, which apparently you could do, and the servant drowned. It doesn't actually explain what the consequences were for the woman then after that. Apparently the consequence was the servant drowned, which was very unfair to the servant or slave and all of that. But like I said, it was a case. Now, why this was difficult, because you might think, well, swim across the river, what's the big deal? The Tigris and the Euphrates were certainly unpredictable, and they were violent and harsh at times, and you had to be a very good swimmer to succeed at this, and even then, depending on the circumstances, you never knew. So it wasn't an easy task, and not everyone was a great swimmer, so there was a variety of things that way. So it did happen. However, more often than not, if you refused to jump in the river to prove your innocence, the husband could use that for a divorce case. Now, why is this important? Remember, a finger is pointed. This one, why there's a harsher consequence, if you will, is because of the assumption that someone isn't going to make a false accusation. Like, the husband isn't just going to get his friend to accuse the wife, because if he gets found out that he made a false accusation, then he gets his eyebrow cut, and then it screws his life over. So because we could look at that and go, oh, well, duh, the husband would just ask a friend. But no, because of 127, it really prevented that from happening. So you were less likely to have a false accusation with 132 than you were with 131. So that's how that one works. Okay. Let's see. Let's look at, the prisoner of war. Here's one for protection, right? 133. If a man is taken prisoner in war and there is sustenance in his house, but his wife leave the house and court and go to another house, because his wife did not keep her court and went to another house, she shall be judicially condemned and thrown into the water. Again, they didn't really throw her in the water. The husband just divorced her. Okay, so the only time we really see jumped in the water was for this case. I don't remember reading any other court case where a woman jumped and had swam in the water or had a slave swim in the water for you, except for when she was accused of cheating. Now, 133 is basically saying if your husband gets caught as a prisoner of war and you have enough in your house to sustain you, like you have enough money and food and all of that, and then you go and you leave your house and, end up finding someone else to marry or hook up with, essentially, then you're guilty, because there is no excuse for you to leave your husband and leave the house, even if he was a prisoner of war. However, there was a condition for this. This is where the protection, I'm just going to put a P by it, right? For protection, we can put this one here. These are protections in a variety of ways. Just making the protection against making sure your husband isn't falsely accusing you of cheating. This is a protection because if anyone's captured in war and there is not sustenance in his house, if his wife go to another house, this woman shall be held blameless. The reality is, you have to understand, is that in a lot of societies, these protections for women weren't there. So even if it doesn't seem like protections to us today, these were protections that didn't exist in other societies. Women were kind of out of luck in a lot of these situations, didn't have protection against divorce, didn't have protection about being left destitute, didn't have protection against false accusations, and they do here. So it may not look like protections to us in present day, but it was. So here, what's the protection? If your husband's captured in war and you don't have enough money to live, you can go end up basically having a relationship with another guy, marrying the other guy, because you never knew if your husband was captured in war, if you'd ever see him again. And if he does return, you're not held guilty. You're seen as blameless. That's an amazing protection in the sense of, there's an understanding that you have to be able to survive, and it's not tough luck. You're just going to wait around and hope your husband comes back and you don't starve in between. No, there are options for you. And then this is a condition for children. If there's no sustenance in the house and you go to another house and have children, and then the husband eventually returns, the wife does have to go back to the first husband, but the children follow their father. This is, I guess I could have just done number 2. That makes more sense, right? I'll just number them. I don't know why I put a P here, right? So this is number 2, number 2, number 2. This is number 1 right here with this, right? So the wife does have to go back to her first husband if he shows up. She's not found guilty because there was no sustenance in the house. And that doesn't just mean food. It means you didn't have the finances to survive without your husband. But if you had children with your new husband, they stay with him, and you have to go back to your first husband. That's definitely a patriarchal society. And, and we could look at what are women's roles and place in society? Well, it's patriarchal, and that, of course, means it's lower than men, right? Men are going to have consideration in all of these ways. So let's keep going. Okay. Here are the divorce ones, and these go over a couple here. So if 137, if a man wish to separate from a woman who has borne him children, or from his wife who has borne him children, then he shall give that wife her dowry and a part of the field, garden, property, so that she can rear her children. When she has brought up her children, a portion of all that is given to the children, equal as that of one son, shall be given to her. Then she can marry. So this part right here also shows patriarchal society. If your husband divorces you and you have children, you can't remarry till your kids are grown, because they don't want another man raising those kids' children, because it's a patrilineal society as well. However, here we have, if a man wish to separate from a woman who has borne him children, or from his wife who has borne him children, then he shall give that wife her dowry and part of a field and garden and property, and she gets to keep a part of the property after the children or with the will, essentially. All of that is a protection. You can do it. Yes, the husband can divorce his wife, but he can't leave her destitute with the children or take the children. She's raising them. So that's a huge thing too. In a lot of patrilineal, patriarchal societies, the men keep the kids and the women just get kicked out and left. Here, it's saying she gets her dowry back if he can't leave her destitute, and he has to provide for her to raise the children. So this one's interesting because it has both. It has both protection, and it also shows us how women were still, though, under kind of these patriarchal rules. The next divorce one, right? These are all divorce. Even having laws about divorce that had anything with looking at women and protecting them was a big deal. And we'll see there's one where a woman can divorce her husband. That's unheard of later. For most of world history, women are not allowed to divorce their husbands, and except for in like the most extreme circumstances. You just couldn't do it. And so the fact that there's one here that lets women divorce their husband was a big deal. And divorce is important. If you can have the ability to divorce, it gives you an aspect of protection that you otherwise wouldn't get. Because if your husband is abusing you or other, taking advantage or completely destroying the household, you can divorce them. And they've shown us that women are less likely to be abused if they have the ability to divorce. If a man wishes to separate from his wife who has borne him no children, he shall give her the amount of her purchase money and dowry which she brought from her father's house and let her go. So again, this is protection because it provides that sense of purchase money. Purchase money is sometimes called the bride price. And I talked about these. The dowry and bride price are purchase money. If you were a high status family, what you would do is that the groom and the groom's family most likely would have to provide a certain amount of money to marry your daughter. Now, this wasn't like selling your daughter. A corrupt person or society could manipulate this to just be selling your daughter. But the purpose was to prove that family had enough resources and money to keep your daughter in the same status as social status as they were used to and born into. So a poor family probably wouldn't have a purchase price and maybe a very, very, very small dowry. A very wealthy, noble family would have a very high purchase price. And if the husband and their family balked at this and was like, oh, we can't pay that, you'd be like, oh, wait, you said you were noble. Obviously, you're not very wealthy, and we don't want you marrying our daughter because you can't afford that. This money almost always went back into the wedding or the wedding feast. The family almost never actually pocketed that money. It went back into that. So it was almost like the groom's family paid for the wedding feast, which they were responsible for, which either came through the bride price or just on its own. So again, this one here, it's saying that if a husband wants to divorce his wife and they don't have any children, he has to give her back, for whatever the reason, except for one. If you are a horrible wife and it lists the reasons, then he doesn't. But for every other reason, if he wants to divorce you, you get the dowry and the purchase price or bride price back, so you're not left destitute. That's the important part. What are these all protecting? That husbands can't just throw their wives out and leave them destitute. If a man's wife, 141, who lives in his house wishes to leave it. So this one is a woman saying she wants to get divorced. But in order to do so, she plunges it into debt, tries to ruin her house, neglects her husband, and is judicially convicted. This part's important. This means that she was charged in court. So it's not just saying, oh, you were a bad wife. If you actively tried to ruin your husband to get a divorce, and then you were taken to court probably by your husband or your husband's family, and they ruled that you were convicted of doing this. So it wasn't an easy process for 141. You had to be judicially convicted for this to count. But it's something that's like seriously actively trying to destroy your husband. If her husband offer her release, she may go on her way, and he gives her nothing as a gift of release. If her husband does not wish to release her, and if he takes another wife, she shall remain as a servant in his house. So this one has a harsh consequence. Basically, they didn't want wives actively trying to get a divorce by destroying their husband's life. And so if you did and you were convicted in court, then he could either do two things: let you go, but he gave you nothing. Or if he remarried, he could make you a servant if he really wanted to pay you back for that. So that one's definitely not, this one would be a 1, I think, just in that, because there aren't rules like this for men, not to this level or degree of harshness for the consequence. If a woman quarrel with her husband and say, you are not congenial to me, which is like, nice and friendly and appropriate to me, the reasons for her prejudice must be presented. If she is guiltless and there is no fault on her part, but he leaves and neglects her, then no guilt attaches to the woman, and she shall take her dowry and go back to her father's house. And when it says he leaves and neglects her, that's not the only thing, but basically this, if women could initiate divorce. This is the only one that does, and you have to prove that you did nothing wrong. So again, there is that undertone of patriarchal structure, but what it allowed was that if you could prove that you had done nothing wrong and your husband was a deadbeat husband, and it didn't mean that he didn't have to physically leave. It could be neglect. It could be being, spending all the money and making him destitute. Then you could divorce your husband. So that was a huge protection. You also have these other two here, 144 and 145. If a man take a wife, and this woman give her husband a maidservant, and she bear him children, but this man takes another wife, this shall not be permitted. Oh, that's not the right one. That one was, family was super important, having children. That was like your legacy in Mesopotamia. And so if a woman couldn't have kids, they weren't polygamous. There were very few cases where you could have a second wife, or husband. It just didn't happen very often. However, one of these ways was if you couldn't bear children, then your husband could take another wife to have kids, but there's protections against you not being kicked out. Let's see. So those were not the ones. 146. If a man take a wife, and she give this man a maidservant as a wife, and she bear him a children, and this maid assume equality with the wife, because she has borne her children, her master shall not sell her for money. That one's protecting women who end up bearing kids. Here, 148. That was the one I was actually looking for. If a man take a wife, and she be seized by disease, so if she has some kind of chronic illness or sickness, if he then desire to take a second wife, he shall not put away his wife, who has been attacked by disease, but he shall keep her in the house which he built, and support her as long as she live. This is important. So if you had a chronic disease and you couldn't have kids, or you just really couldn't do a lot anymore, were societies where women kind of got kicked out. And while this allows the husband to take a second wife, which you could argue about that component of it, it does prevent him from just disowning this woman, divorcing this woman, and leaving her destitute. It goes on to say, if the woman does not wish to remain in her husband's home, then he shall compensate her for her dowry that she brought with her from her father's house, and she may go. So if you don't want to stay, if your husband's like, look, we can't have children, you have this chronic illness, you can't do any of the wifely duties, if you will, I'm going to take another wife. But don't worry, you're still part of the family. She could be like, nah, I'm good. I'm not going to stay here with a second wife. Then he has to give her her dowry, and she's free to go. So that is a protection in that sense. All right, we're going to leave it at that for those ones. This talks about adoption, protection, and kids not being taken advantage of as well. The farming law codes. How did the law codes address problems that were present with agriculture in Mesopotamian society? What do the law codes tell you about economic structure of Mesopotamia? So let's look at this. there's a lot in here about being lazy and not doing work. So that would be one of the problems, right? So this is one, right? Lazy, being lazy. There's going to be theft is another problem we see as well. So if anyone take over a field to till it and obtain no harvest, it must be proved that he did no work on the field, and he must deliver grain just as his neighbor raised to the owner of the field. So why this? Well, a lot of Mesopotamia was rent. There were people that owned land, but there were a lot of people that rented farms. And there were two ways to pay rent. The first was you paid ahead in advance and on an agreed upon sum. The reason to do that is it would sometimes be cheaper, especially if you had a really good crop year. The more common one is you paid a percentage of crop production, right? So your rent, I'll put an asterisk, right? This was the most common one here. Your rent was based on, for most people, they paid a percentage of the crop production. So obviously people thought about this and were like, yes, I know how to get free rent. I just won't till or farm the land. And then I have zero crop production and I have zero rent. And so at some point, one of the kings had to make a law that said, no, if you intentionally don't till your field and farm your field, you are going to pay. We're just going to look to the neighbor, and whatever they produced, we're going to assume your output would be similar, and you're obligated to pay that amount. And then it says another one, same thing, right? If he does not till the field but lets it lie fallow, he shall give grain like his neighbors to the owner. And then the field which he let lie fallow, he must plow and sow and return to the owner. So this one, the other one is this one is you tilled it but got no harvest. So one of the things that also tells us, if you were paying a percentage of crop production and you tilled the farm and you planted and something happened and so there was no harvest because of drought or a flood, this didn't count. There was relief. You didn't necessarily owe rent if you were not able to produce anything, right? You had to prove that you didn't do any work on the field. Okay, so that's this one. This is very similar, but it's different. This one is you did not till the field and you let it lie fallow. So this is clearly intentionally doing nothing. I think I kind of mentioned with that, but this one is that you had to prove it. This is suggesting that someone might have done it, but then if they prove they didn't. This one is just clear cut. No, we know they didn't. Then you had to give the grain like the neighbors, and you had to go plow it and sow it before you returned it. So you're going to get it set up for the owner before you leave. This one just says straight up lazy, right? Well, 44. If anyone take over a waistline field and make it arable, but is lazy and does not make it arable, he shall plow the fallow field, which is empty field, in the 4th year, till it and give it back to its owner. And then he has to pay money too. So this is also protection for owners, right? Landowners. There's going to be protection for other things too. So you both have that. You're going to have protection for renters. We'll look at that in just a minute. So there's protections for both. Here's the fixed rental, right, that you pay. If a man rent his field for tillage for a fixed rental and receive the rent of his field, but bad weather come and destroy the harvest, the injury falls upon the tiller of the soil. So this one is saying if you have a bad harvest but you paid fixed rental, it's your loss. However, if you didn't pay fixed rental, you paid the percentage of crop, and then the grain will be divided between the tiller and the owner with whatever you had. And so that if you only got a tiny little bit, then you don't have to pay as much, basically. Nope. If the tiller, because he did not succeed in the first year, has had the soil tilled by others, the owner may raise no objection. So that's just saying, like, if you have someone else help you or do the work, the owner can't claim, no, you have to do it. This is an important one, 53. If anyone be too lazy to keep his dam in proper condition and does not keep it, then the dam break and all the fields be flooded, then the person who didn't keep their dam will be sold for money. And the money that was sold, that you got from selling the person into slavery, will be paid to the other people. So this is an owner. And let's say you have your field. What they had were these kind of dams, as they're calling it, and they had little holes with plugs in it. And then you would release the plugs, and it would allow the water to water your field. But the problem is you had neighbors on either side of you. If you didn't upkeep this and make sure there weren't leaks, or if you were just lazy and you left the plugs out after you were watering, it would flood your neighbor's fields and ruin the crops. And so what they're saying with there is if that happened, you had to pay for your neighbor's crops. If you could not pay, they sold you into what was called debt slavery, which was a very common form of slavery in most of the world in the ancient period of time, which was you were sold into slavery to pay off your debt. It was not permanent. It was based on paying your debt. Once your debt was paid, you were no longer a slave. So if you couldn't pay for the damage you caused because of your negligence, then they sold you into debt slavery, and the money that they got from that would go to pay the owners of the other fields that you destroyed, which is protecting, right, that you don't have a horrible neighbor that doesn't do anything. And then if they couldn't pay for that, right, besides being sold into slavery, if you either couldn't pay and then they sold you into slavery and that still didn't cover the cost, all your possessions would be sold as well. This is the careless one, right? So one is upkeep. If anyone opened his ditches to water his crop, but is careless, and the water flooded the field of his neighbor, he shall pay his neighbor the corn for his loss. So there's one of being lazy, there's one of being careless, and they're drawing distinctions. They're basically the same kind of thing, but it is interesting that it's if you're careless versus if you're lazy of upkeep, that there's different consequences. Usually with these, they kind of all ran together in court cases. So you usually had to pay the cost, or you got sold into debt slavery for any of those circumstances. Let's see. This is a good one for showing reactive nature of law codes. 248, 249. If anyone hire an ox and break off a horn or cut off his tail or hurt his muzzle, he shall pay 1/4 of its value in money. This is if you're renting animals for use and you're careless and you hurt the animal, you have to pay for destruction of property. And then this one, if anyone hire an ox and God strike it that it die, that man who hired it shall swear by God and be considered guiltless. So here, if something happens where it's not your fault, then you don't get charged for it. And then 251, if an ox be a goring ox, and it's shown that he is a gorer, and he did not bind his horns, or fasten the ox up, and the ox gore a freeborn man and kill him, the owner shall pay 1/2 a mina in money. And the minas are just different weights, right? There's no coins yet. It was weights in various metals or precious stones, or weight in grain and other things like that. It depended on the case. They did have like silver rings that were like silver bands, and like it kind of twisted up, and you'd wear it as that's my awesome finger drawing, right? You'd wear it on your finger, it didn't go all the way up, and then you would cut off pieces when you wanted to purchase something. The wealthy had that. Lower class people in Mesopotamia paid in usually grain of some kind. But you did have some precious stones and metals that you could pay. There was gold that was used as well. So this one's really specific. This is saying if you have an ox and it is actually with its horns gored someone before, stabbed them with their horns, and you know that your ox likes to stab people, you're responsible for binding the horns, dulling them, or keeping the ox tied up so it doesn't gore people. If you know your ox does this and you're not careful and you don't protect against it stabbing people with its horns, then you have to pay for that. That's really specific. So that must have been a problem. The other one that's specific, right, is if you hire an ox and you break off the horn, cut off its tail, or hurt its muzzle. Those things are really specific. Rather than just saying, like, if you rent an animal and you hurt it in any way, there's consequences. No, these are things that must have happened when they rented oxen and then a horn broke, or they cut off the tail, or they hurt the muzzle because they were too harsh when they were pulling them for tilling the field. that they had to make a law from this. Likewise, there must have been oxen that kept goring people, that they finally made a law about it. So that's the nature of reactive law codes. They're super specific. Instead of kind of covering a universal blanket idea of don't hurt your rented animals, here's specifics of that. But it shows us that, again, these were problems in society. Not that they were hurting all animals, but when they rented specifically, oxen and stuff, that clearly there were people who didn't know how to use them when they were farming, and they were hurting their muzzle, probably from pulling too hard, and also potentially breaking the horns. The cutting off the tail sounds way more intentional, and why that was a problem, don't know, but it clearly was. And then there's some for just rent prices. So if you go down here, it talks about if you hire an oxen, a cart, and a driver, here's the basic price that one should pay. This was to prevent renters being taken advantage of. Okay, so like 40 kov of corn, right? That's a type of weight of corn, specific with corn. The mina is a weight. Shekels are like smaller amounts in coins. And some of these translations vary in what they were actually using. But mina is going to be more than shekel. Ka is a weight in corn, which I don't know if they give any other weight examples, but just know shekels is less, mina is more. Okay, so what does that tell us? Well, like think about, right, what are the problems that are present? Theft or in the sense of like, you know, trying to steal rent or animals, but you also have what would we call it? Destruction of property. That's more than theft, right? Theft in specifically from being lazy. But protection of owners and renters because of that, and then destruction of property were big ones. As far as what does it tell you about the economic structure? Well, one, that people rented, right? They didn't just own land. And that there were different prices for different things, and even that they could rent out the whole thing till they're filled. They may not own any of that, and that you would pay with different amounts. Oh, here's another one. 10 gur of corn is more than ka of corn. So that you had what would we call it? Your production of food, right? That you had a barter system or trade system that essentially with this, that agricultural production was one way, was actually the biggest way that you paid, right? Which was grains. And corn doesn't necessarily mean corn like maize like we think of this. Corn actually was a generic term for grain. So agricultural production, specifically with grain, that you paid through what you produced. And then there was precious metals and stones. Whoops. Come back. That like gold and others that you could use to pay as well. And then the renting and owning. Okay, so the last one, and actually I'm going to do these in two separate things. We're going to do Hammurabi's Law Codes. I'm going to stop the recording there, and then I'm going to record separately the Mesopotamian outlook. Civil law codes. How did the concept of justice differ per social class? What do the law codes tell you about what problems were present in Mesopotamian society? Right. So this one here, we have a lot of theft. That is a big issue. Right, if anyone steal the property of a temple or the court, he shall be put to death. Now, again, how often they put people to death? Not very often, but it was more serious to steal from the temple, right? Because that's stealing from the gods. So there definitely were harsher punishments for stealing from the temple than stealing from people, but both could be potentially significant. If anyone is committing a robbery and is caught, then he shall be put to death. If a persons are stolen, they talk about, so this is if you steal a person, if you kidnap a person, or if you try to steal a runaway slave. This is one. If a fire break out in a house, and someone who comes to put it out casts his eye upon the property of the owner of the house, and take the property of the master of the house, he shall be thrown into that same fire. They didn't like this. This was like opportunity theft. So this is like, oh, someone's house is on fire, and you go to help, and then instead of helping, you're like, oh, I could totally just steal all their stuff. That was seen as especially egregious. They didn't like that. Now, did they throw you into the fire? No. If people beat you up and killed you because they caught you stealing while a fire was happening, they probably wouldn't be charged with anything. But there were serious penalties for that as well, because that was seen as such an egregious kind of act, to try to pretend you're helping someone in need and then stealing from them. Then okay, here's if a son strike his father. Here's the ones where we see, this is where you get, 196 is actually the eye for eye justice, when you talk about that saying. Now, again, most of the time, let's not focus so much on the actual punishment as what it implied, because most of these, they weren't cutting off or poking out eyes. There was monetary compensation. But more like what it tells us, because a lot of these are going to show social class here. Let's look at it. Here we go. Teeth. If a man knock out the teeth of his equal, his teeth shall be knocked out. So all that's saying is, if you end up, one of the other problems, let's put that one. There's theft. There is apparently a lot of physical violence. All the ones we're going to look at next have to do with physical violence in that, which clearly was problematic. Okay, if a man knock out a teeth of his equal, his teeth shall be knocked out. So they didn't knock out the teeth. But again, the idea is that whatever the consequence was, it should be of equal value of what you did to that other person. So what's the value of someone's teeth, your teeth being knocked out, right? That's a compensation. However, if you knocked out the teeth of a freedman, he shall pay 1/3 of a gold mina. And then there's other ones that talk about slaves. So we'll find an example of that. Essentially, you had, and this, there were a variety of terminology they use here. And the translation for this isn't the best. You have freeborn and freed, and then slave. Oh, here we go. 203, 204, and 205 has all of them, right? So freeborn was essentially the nobility. It was the highest class. Then you have freed man, and that would be the commoners, most of the population. And then you had slaves. So this was the social structure of Mesopotamia. And there were, obviously, social class was so important that they put it in the law codes. Almost around the world, most law codes don't differ between classes in the law codes. They still might do it in practice, but they don't put it in the law codes. Here in Mesopotamia, your social status was very important, to the point that they put it in the law codes to specify that. So if a freeborn man strike the body of another freeborn man or equal rank, he shall pay 1 gold mina. So if you strike someone of equal rank, you pay 1 gold mina. If a free man strike the body of another free man, he shall pay 10 shekels. That's less. If a slave of a free man strike the body of a free man, his ear shall be cut off. Now this is showing someone who was of lower status hurting someone above them. You had a harsher consequence. If it was a slave, they possibly did sometimes cut off their ear. Other times they just made the owner pay a lot of money. If a man strike a freeborn woman so that she lose her unborn child, he shall pay 10 shekels for the loss. If the woman die, his daughter shall be put to death. Now, just to clarify, they did not kill children for their parents. That would just be so harsh. Well, look at the Assyrians, where they did do some of these things. The Assyrians were in Mesopotamia, but they weren't Mesopotamian in culture. They impaled people and flayed people alive. So they were brutal. Mesopotamia was not. As much as this makes some Mesopotamians look brutal, they were not, okay? They did not kill children. It was more the idea of what's the equal consequence. You hit a woman and her unborn child died. The equal consequence is your child died, right? But they didn't do that. You just paid compensation. But it was meant to point out the seriousness of that you should be charged or have a consequence that was equal in nature to the harm you caused. So hopefully that makes sense. If you're not clear, if you're not clear on that, please let me know, because what I don't want, like for the test, if you were talking about it, or a paper that we're going to be doing with writing, and I don't want it to end up where you focus only on the violence, because the Mesopotamians were not that violent of a people in terms of brutally murdering and killing people that had nothing to do with the original crime. They weren't chopping off hands all the time. They weren't putting out eyes and killing children, right? There were compensations, but it was meant to show that equal consequence, right? Okay, so hopefully that's clear. If it's not, please contact me and I'll go over it more with you. If a woman of a free class lose her child by a blow, he shall pay 5 shekels. So look, here's the difference. 10 shekels to a higher class woman, 5 shekels for a commoner. If the woman die, he shall pay half a mina. And if you strike a maidservant, a servant or slave, and she lose her child, you should pay 2 shekels. So here's that. This one all shows social class, and the fact that if you were wealthy, you could technically abuse people and steal and hurt people. The theft was different. That didn't matter your rank. But the physical violence essentially is you could essentially commit a crime against someone, or especially with physical violence, against someone of lower class, and you would have a far less consequence than someone of lower class striking someone above you. However, if you if you striked someone who was of equal class, then you had the same consequence. So it really did matter how you were treated in Mesopotamian society based on what your social standing was. And this clearly shows that. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Like I said, I'm going to do these in 2 separate things. So I'm going to post this one, and then I'll do the Mesopotamian Outlook in Life, and that one should post soon after.